Let's do it.
Here we go, Bruce. It's been a while.
Ron, how you doing, buddy?
I love how we start. When you and I see each other, we never like Bruce, Ron.
It's a little bit more theatrical here, Ron.
Yeah, we turn it up for the audience. Welcome to another episode of the R&B Show. We are back again. You know, we take these little hiatuses and then we come back, right? That's what we do. No shame.
Yeah, better than ever, though.
Better than ever. And today is a special day, especially special. Because we're going to talk about Revolver today, but this is the song that got me to learn how to play guitar. I mean, this is the album that got me to learn to play guitar. For some random reason, I'm Only Sleeping was the first song I ever, I taught myself to play guitar I had the Beatles White Anthology book. I think we've talked about this. And I was like, I'm Only Sleeping. Like, that looks like an easy song to learn. And that's literally how I learned guitar. So as much as I talk shit about John Lennon taught me to be a mediocre guitar player.
Well, the funny thing about
he's a great
what I've learned, what I've learned about trying to teach yourself Beatles stuff on guitar, again, it's the deceptive simplicity of these songs, because you kind of think, okay, that one sounds like one I can tackle, right? And you go into and actually dig into the intricacies of it, and it's not. I don't think there's any easy Beatles song on guitar, so.
Right. No, I mean, that song, I've never played that. So in 1995 was when I again, I was like, I'm not good at taking lessons and things, so I had to figure it out for myself. And I used to bring the guitar to parties. All my friends were really good guitar players, and I would just strum, I'd have but later in life, as I got stronger and definitely have more confidence in my singing, I don't know why I picked that song. That song is hard on so many levels, even just singing it right on the break. And that's a hard song. So
yeah, because he does that long sustained high note too, going into the chorus and all that stuff. Yeah,
right. And it sits on E. It's for me, it's right on my break. So it's yeah, it's really challenging, man. Anyway, so Revolver, I have so many questions for you, Bruce. Bruce, what's first of all, when do you first remember connecting with this album? When was the first time you were like, oh, cool? How old were you? What were you wearing?
This is a great question, right? Because I think a lot of the Revolver songs, to me, in my memory as a child, they used to, I think the Beatles cartoon was in syndication, right? The Beatles cartoon in the 60s. So you'd watch that, I think, on a Saturday morning or whatever. And I remember a lot of the Revolver songs being featured on the cartoon, probably because I think the cartoon started in 66. It may have been 65, but around that period. So I feel like I have memories of these songs connected to the Beatles cartoon. But the funny thing too, Ron, I have to confess, and we're probably going to lose people right off the jump here. I've always had a little bit of a kind of a controversial, or I guess a hot take, what some would call it now, with Revolver and the Sgt. Pepper period. Because for me, I love all the early Beatles stuff up to Rubber Soul. And then I love the White Album through Abbey Road. But Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, as celebrated as these albums are, I never fully connected with these albums. And I never understood why until as an adult, maybe analyzing a bit more. And I think a lot of the reason was because, as I look back now, that's kind of where the Beatles started to get a little self-consciously arty, in a way. They were definitely moving away from the classic early Beatlemania sound. And Revolver is the first album where they're really using the studio as the instrument. So it's an interesting thing. But now, thanks to this remix, I have a whole different view of Revolver, and I kind of feel like finally I get it. And that's going to be the crux of what we're going to discuss. Is going to be this remix.
Okay, that's huge. I have so many questions for you about that, and I love that you frame it like that. But before we move further, follow, do all the things, right? You told me to do that right before we started. I forgot to do it. So
no, absolutely, yeah. If you can, subscribe if you like what you see, and also just a kind of a sneak preview for people who've followed us for a while now. Ron and I are going to be starting a new series soon. So we're going to be once a month tackling a classic album, and we're going to decide whether this album is overrated or not. And that should make for some pretty interesting conversation, that's for sure.
Well, so I love, love that you're bringing this up, that like the idea that this is a turning point, right? Rubber Soul into this. Um, and so I want to talk to you all about that. A lot of things came up to me with this listen through, like listening to the remastered version too, especially having the parts separated. You can hear like the different things they're bringing into it. And like I have to appreciate, because I love Rubber Soul, like, and I loved Revolver growing up was my favorite album, right? Like Rubber Soul for me is like, because I think so much of it is like folk rock in a way, like In My Life and
Yeah,
Norwegian Wood, and I like, to me I was like, oh my god, that's like my jam right there, you know. This, I think you're right. Like this, we get into the psychedelic era. So much experimentation with Hindu music, and is that right? Like, or yeah, Hindu.
Indian music. Yep.
Yeah, right. Like so world music, like all this. But you definitely get a sense, which is really cool. And maybe it's because I'm almost 70 now. Like as I get older, like you get a sense that like it is still a bunch of young dudes like 20-something-year-olds experimenting with unlimited possibilities, to some extent unlimited budget. I know they had a 3-month like hiatus right before, so they're
Yep.
rested. They're like they're firing on all cylinders creatively. Like, and so it's like I loved it for that reason. I was like, oh, that is fascinating that you have these guys like they've been away from the studio, they've been away from performing, they're not performing anymore, they're not like limited by what they're gonna have to recreate later. I like you it's like a full playground. And I never appreciated that. I started listening to it in 94, 95, 95. And I remember that, and I was doing drugs, like I was smoking pot at the time and do whatever. And like, so it was just something you did in high school. You know, you smoke pot and you listen to like, what, like, oh my God, what's, Tomorrow,
Never knows. Yeah.
Tomorrow Never Knows. Yeah, I was gonna say Tomorrow Never Knows. And I was like, wait, that's like a Bond movie.
It does.
Right, Tomorrow Never Knows. Yeah, you like listen to Tomorrow Never Knows, like all these. So yeah, okay. So I want to ask you though. Okay, here we go. First of all, I just want to address logistically something about this time period. And then I want to get into what your new findings were from this listen. But so there's like a difference, there's like a disconnect between the American release and the UK releases, right? Like Rubber Soul didn't come out right before this in the United States. It was like, what was it, yesterday and today or something, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's that about? What the fuck? Why is that?
Well, and it's funny because now American fans, probably those who grew up with like the Capitol versions of the albums, which are the American releases, you see now there's kind of like some fond nostalgia for that, but they weren't really getting the real representation of the way the Beatles wanted these albums released. To do that, you'd have to go to the UK versions, which is why kind of the UK is the gold standard, and with all these box sets and everything that comes out, it's the UK version of the albums. Well, what happened is Capitol, the American record company, would kind of basically butcher these albums, which is, kind of leads to like the butcher cover as kind of a statement on that. But they would pull songs that were kind of meant for the UK release and basically try and make more albums in other words, so you would get something like Yesterday and Today, which is like a hodgepodge of stuff, and they asked for additional tracks that the Beatles were in progress, and so George Martin sends them, And Your Bird Can Sing and a few of these other gems, and many of the Capitol albums up until Sgt. Pepper, where the Beatles kind of had the stroke to say no, it's going to be a uniform release kind of worldwide. You have very weird representations. Like my exposure to Rubber Soul was the US version. And it starts so differently because I think the UK version starts with Drive My Car, whereas I think the American version starts with I've Just Seen a Face, I believe. It's just a whole different way to experience the album. So, and that was my experience with a lot of the US albums. So when I had to go back and listen to the UK version, even though that's the official version, it's a different thing to experience. But for the pure version, you have to go UK.
That's blowing my mind. Yeah, like I've Just Seen a Face. I guess it kind of makes sense a little bit on Rubber Soul, but like kind of not. Like I know that to me is so earlier. Like, but again, we're talking about a span of 5 years. Like,
I know. Most groups today be like 5 years between albums, and when you
right.
think of back then, there's just the way the pace of it was so different.
Yeah, they were grinding them out. Jesus. So, okay. Here we go. Why did they remaster this now? Like, what do you know? Like, what's the story behind this reissue?
Well, they've been for the past several years, they've been going back and remixing the albums. I think they started with Pepper, and then they kind of went chronologically from then on. But what's interesting now, and I'm glad that you bring this up, because I feel like in a lot of the reviews that I'm seeing for this new remix, not enough people are actually talking up the importance of the demixing technology that we have now. This is going to be huge. It's going to have huge implications for catalog artists moving forward. Because now with Revolver, what happens is we got Get Back, the big Beatles project of last year, finally, the kind of long delayed Let It Be and all that stuff, and Peter Jackson's version. But Peter Jackson's audio team, as part of that project, were able to create this audio technology that they can finally, separate audio elements on a single track. That is huge, huge, huge. Because a lot of the Beatles stuff was recorded, as up until like Abbey Road, primarily on 4-track. So you have stuff locked into individual tracks, and prior to this, you couldn't really separate those elements. Now, the fact that they can do this makes, I think, this particular release, as opposed to the others, so much more significant. And I think it also has, again, wide-ranging implications. I know Peter Jackson has said that he's just used this technology just for Get Back, and he allowed it for Beatles-related projects. But the guy's sitting on a gold mine, in terms of if he wants to get, depending the extent he wants to get involved with the music business. Because what this technology does is it liberates not only the rest of the Beatles catalog, which is good that they timed it this way, because now they can go back and do the early ones and properly do real meaningful remixes, which I feel this is the first one to really do so. But other catalog artists, if they want to do that, all the 60s stuff that was recorded 4-track can now be redone. Probably the 50s stuff as well, which if an estate like Elvis's estate wants to tackle this and do that, then you're going to get a whole new round of remixes that everyone has to buy again. But people will do it because, if this is any indication, it is giving it a very fresh coat of paint, and it's eye-opening. At least I found it so.
Oh yeah, it's super fresh. Like, I was blown away because they also I was listening to it on Spotify, and which is probably not the best. Like, you were probably listening to the vinyl, and you could hear all this. I don't know. Did you?
Not yet. I will have to say. So this copy here is my mono copy from the mono box set. Yeah. I'm waiting on the box set because it's way overpriced at the moment, and it will come down in time. So same thing. I listened to it on Apple.
You can hear the
streamed
difference.
Streamed it, but I also have to say too, before we move on to our actual analysis of it, is that if you haven't listened to it on headphones, the stereo remix on headphones, you're robbing yourself of experience, because this is a very 3-dimensional album, and it is a headphone album for sure.
Yeah, it was such a difference, car to the earphones, very different. So, and what, just for the listeners at home, what did you from a technical perspective? What did you notice is the difference from the mono to this?
That's another interesting question, because I've seen other people analyze, as part of the box set, they also have a new mono mix. So a lot of people are going back and forth on the stereo versus mono. And I have to say, honestly, even though I respect mono because that was the primary format that the Beatles championed in the 60s, it was the main thing that they put all their concentration on was the mono mix, so that these albums would sound good on a car stereo or a shitty little record player that most teenagers had. That was the art then. But I challenge anyone, go and listen to the new stereo mix of just the first track, Taxman, and listen to the mono. There's no comparison. The stereo version pops. It is hot, world of difference. So for me, for the majority of this, it was really, again, the stereo remix that was the revelation.
Yeah, I mean, just vocals, like even just all the the harmonies were just so, they landed more,
The rhythm section, I feel that's another thing that's going to be the main ways that the early Beatles catalog, when they remix it, is going to benefit, because as great as John and as great as Paul and Ringo were on those albums, a lot of that stuff, they never were able to really pull that up in the mix a lot, and now they'll be able to do that. And you can tell on this, because Paul and Ringo really shine on this remix.
100%, 100%. So were there any songs that stuck out for you this time around where you're like, oh, I never thought about that song?
Man, I think right out the gate, maybe the first four to me was just like gangbusters, right? Like, we get right into like Taxman, already I'm sold because I hear a world of difference. Because again, with these remixes, as interesting as they've been more like curiosity pieces to me up until this point. This is an album that I think really, for the first time, benefits from a remix where it feels meaningful. And funnily enough, I had a similar experience with they did Pink Floyd's Animals. I think last month they released that, and it was significant enough where I go, okay, this merits release. But Taxman stood out. Again, Paul's stunning bass and guitar work on that really, really pop. It reminded me that this is like the album where George really starts coming into his own, because all his songs on here are great. But also, this is the album where Paul also starts his ascendancy in the Beatles.
I read a review that they had like a critic or like a rock critic like interview all four of them separately. Sorry, there's like a car alarm going off here. They interviewed all four of them separately at the time, just like right before the album release. And they were like, John is kind of like John was the leader before, but like John at this point was lazy and just like checked out in a way. And then Paul really steps up as leader now and just is so driven to be this like creative powerhouse, I think, right? And you hear it in this album for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like Success did something for John, whereas like, I think the chase in those early years was important for John to make it, and I think once he made it, it was, I think, something for John where, like, with John always being a searcher, it kind of realized like, okay, fame and success wasn't the thing. So I believe like something like this is a turning point where like the Beatles is not going to really hold his full passion and interest moving forward. I think he's going to kind of still be searching, and eventually we'll see he finds more, I guess, what he's looking for through his relationship with Yoko moving forward. But yeah, here's where Paul really starts kind of, stepping up his game, and finally I think measures up to John in terms of, on artistic grounds. And that's proved by the next song, which also stood out for me, which is Eleanor Rigby. This is a song that, great lyrics for Paul, but also this is not your typical pop song. You have those, like, the string work here, to me, it stands out more than ever. It's stunning. Paul's vocals are great. This is like a 1-2 punch with these first two tracks on this album. How about for you?
Yeah, I want to address that. Eleanor Rigby. To me, this is like, and I don't know if this is like my theater background or whatever, but to me, Eleanor Rigby is like this window or pocket where I'm like, I wonder if like that's what he really wanted to write, like something that like epic, right? Like, if and he never, like, I don't think he ever goes back to something like that, right? Like Wings is so poppy. I like Wings, like, I love, like, again, huge Paul fan, but like, to me, that, like, I wouldn't say bombastic, like something that epic and grand in scale, right? Like and theatrical and with the what, octet? It's an octet, right?
Yeah.
Like,
It's like,
why didn't he
like chamber pop,
chamber?
it's yeah. I mean, Paul was always ambitious, and but I think like what you touched upon, like with this, probably doesn't fully touch upon this until maybe Abbey Road again with the suite, that him and George Martin kind of constructed. It kind of fed into that, because all of them, I think, especially Paul, there was that classical influence and kind of being open to that, particularly after seeing, the little touches that the strings added to Yesterday and all that stuff. So
Right. This is
yeah, but again, from then on, then like, I'm Only Sleeping. Again, Paul's bass sounding really punchy. The vocals are prominent. Love the backwards guitars. That stuff sounds amazing. Love You Too was another standout. Again, with the Indian instrument, the sitar work. I mean, that really shimmered for me on this new remix. So I really love that. And actually, that Love You Too is probably my favorite of like the Indian influence stuff for George. Just think
yeah.
it's an awesome track.
Dude, George, like I texted you. It's so funny. I was texting you very like knee-jerk reactions while I was listening to it. I was waiting for my kid to come out of dance, and I was like, and I was like, I was like, fuck John, and then I was at it with like, fuck Kathleen Kennedy, But like the truth of it is that my favorite songs in this album, my realization after this listening,
Are
all the
John's.
John songs. Yeah, they're all John songs. I'm like,
Yeah,
God,
to
like
me, this is the same reaction that I had to the White Album, where as good as Paul's songs were on the White Album, to me, like John did not have a Duff song on the White Album, and he does not have a Duff song on this. All
right.
of John's songs on this are killer. They're great songs, you know. And
Yeah.
it's more like guitar driven stuff, and you know, there's some power pop in there with "And Your Bird Can Sing." I love it, you know, and again, there's fond memories of that again associated with the cartoon. I remember "And Your Bird Can Sing" being featured on there and stuff like that, but.
You know, because
Yeah, I love all of John's tracks on here.
I think for me, my favorite John period is Rubber Soul and Revolver because
Yeah,
I think he finds this like again, he finds this like almost like troubadour quality, and then he's adding the layers of psychedelia, like psychedelic and like and you know, he's trying to be more like all the quite like all the Eastern philosophy and all that stuff. But like this is my opinion. I'm in the self-help business. Like I work with a lot of coaches and everything I talk about all the time. So I'm in that self-help world, very different, obviously, 2022 than 1966. But to me, I don't think that I think he was searching. Like I think when George like was in that world of like Eastern philosophy and you know, like trying to figure out like his place in the universe and all that. I think George, it like really made sense. I think John, I don't know that it like really seeped in. You know,
yeah,
I think it seemed kind of cool. Like it was like, oh, I want to try this. And he had that like whimsy and like that fucking like over the top nature and like bipolar quality and whatever. You know, so like like he's always like high energy and then like crashing or whatever. So like I don't think he ever found peace in that world. So in this album, I think he's edging into bringing in some of these Eastern philosophy ideas and like these like lost in the universe ideas, but like I don't think it's like fully like I don't think he fully like sees himself in that yet. So it's like the perfect blend for me is what I'm trying to say. Like I don't think it's too
yeah,
heady yet. I think it feels like exciting. Like he's like, oh, these are some concepts that I'm playing with in life. I'm gonna bring them into my music, but I'm still gonna keep it like very like acoustic and like I mean, again, there's with like they're messing with tracks and speeds and stuff, but like to me, it's still like John with the acoustic guitar in many ways, you know?
to me, the 65, 66 version of John is the coolest version of John by far. So I would definitely agree with
Yeah.
that. I think it's, you know, some of his best material. You know, he hadn't yet, I think, you know, crowned himself like, you know, kind of seen himself as a working class hero and, you know, the peace advocate and all that stuff. You know, like you said, it's kind of a good happy medium, you know, where
Yeah.
he's, you know, opening to new ideas, but still kind of had that edge of the guy that you did not want to mess with, you know, which is, you know, kind of like you know, as complicated as John was, that's kind of also the appeal of his particular appeal.
See, like as we're saying that, I agree, like, yeah, this is the coolest. And I think this is like this is the and again, because I always like I said, I texted you, fuck John, and I'm always like anti-John. But like gun to the head, I can't say that like his songs are not my favorite from the earlier period. Right? Like his songs are on my like I definitely like his output much more
Well, and
than
you
Paul
liked
and
all
the
this stuff from like later period too. So really, a lot of John's stuff is really among your favorite stuff. You know, it's just you know.
You don't have to get nasty right now, okay? What do I like on the later period? I'm just kidding. I know I love Come Together. Like whatever. The point is that I know I just maybe it's like
You have
separating
a
that.
complicated relationship with John
I think it's separating the artist
from
from
the
the
art.
output. Yeah, from the
Yeah,
art. Yeah.
yeah.
Because he just reminds me of my arch nemesis, that's all.
You know, let me ask you, because you asked me about some standouts.
I'll let you.
What were
I'll
some of
let you.
what were some of the standouts for you?
Okay, I feel like, man, if I like this is me just being in my head. Like if I'm watching me, like if I was watching me, I'd probably hate me as a presenter on this because I'm fucking like I think that like yeah, like at my core, I'm a suburban dad. Like this is what I've realized. I'm a suburban dad. I perform sometimes, I do comedy, whatever, but like I'm a suburban dad. I'm very basic. Got to Get You Into My Life. I fucking love this song so much. And so it's like, I don't know, to me, that's like such a poppy song. It's like the least artistic. It's like, I mean, it's got that like great, like big band, like we talked about, like that 60s, like soul, like I love it. But like to me, that's like the least interesting song in the whole album. And that song I listened to 4 times. I listened to the rehearsals. I love that song on so many levels.
Well, you know, the irony too, again, you know, because prior to this, we got Paperback Writer and Rain, which we'll get to later as a singles release. You know,
Right,
never
right.
stuff off of this album, even though everyone knows Yellow Submarine. But got to get you into my life, not released as a single then, but many years later in Reissue's campaign in the mid '70s, it was like released and became a huge hit again. You know, like for the first time as an actual single. So that song was always meant to be a single. It just has, it's like classic effervescent McCartney, which
Right.
is also on, you know, on Good Day Sunshine and this. It's Paul at his optimistic best, where it's not saccharine, you know, it's a sharp pop tune and just strikes that right perfect balance, you know, McCartney's sweet spot.
Like, and that in contrast to I Saw Her Standing There, like to me that song is so weird, you know? Like it's a great, like the music is great, but like the words are very troubling, you know, Saw Her Standing There,
Well,
like different
it's
time
funny you
period.
mentioned that because I was just thinking about that earlier today, that song. And you know, of course we're seeing it now, but it was probably an 18-year-old or whatever he was, you know, age he was that he when he wrote it, you know.
Right,
So it's like,
right.
come on. It's weird now a 70-year-old singing it, but you know, it's or 80-year-old, but
Right, it's very awkward. But even just like in terms of like his that Paul optimistic, like you know, like at his best. So I just feel like to me, like Got to Get You Into Your Life is much more much more complex musically, but like again, it has that optimism and it's just so cohesive. It's so tight. But like I said to you before the call, like Rain, God, like Rain. I never really like paid too much attention to that song. I'm in love with that song now. Like I'm gonna go listen to it again today. Like Rain, and Your Bird Can Sing. I was like, God, I love that song.
great song. Great
Yeah,
song. That you talk about power pop, that is power pop. You know,
but
just a catchy, great tune, you know, and like again, you know, uh, I keep harping on this, but like Paul's bass playing throughout this album, I feel like this is also the beginning of like him really taking ownership of that instrument, because you listen to the bass parts on this and just amazing stuff being played. And again, you know, like Ringo's drums on stuff like, you know, his fills on like something like She Said.
yeah,
Awesome drumming by Ringo on that.
they have so much nostalgia. She said like that, like that, I remember listening to that in high school, and like because the anthology albums had just come out, like the Beatles anthology, like so I remember just listening to all those different cuts of that, like. But yeah, listening to it now, it's just so rich and full. Paul, right? Like Paul was reluctant as a bass player up until this point, right?
Originally, right? Because like as the way he put it, so don't no one cancel me, please. But the way Paul said was, it was always the fat guy in the group that played bass. So it was a very non-glamorous instrument. Nobody wanted to do it. So, you know, when Stu Sutcliffe, you know, had to leave the group or chose to leave the group to focus on painting, you know,
Yeah.
really John was not going to play bass, and George was too good because George was actually a better guitar player than John or Paul then. So George was not going to be saddled with bass. So Paul, being Mr. Versatile, you know, jumped on it, and eventually, because he's sort of in a way he was one of their original guitarists, he brings that sensibility to it almost as a, and also because he's, you know, he's a front guy, so he wants to get noticed. So it's almost like Keith
Yeah.
Moon on drums, where it's like Keith is like forward facing and he's not going to be taking a backseat, you know, even though he's a drummer. Paul was not going to take a backseat as a bass player. So it's almost like he's playing for attention. But it's in league with what was starting to happen in the 60s, where it was not just root fifth, or whatever. Um, you know, it was starting to get much more melodic stuff. Paul was being influenced by James Jamerson, the awesome Motown bass player and stuff. So, you know, it was like a perfect storm. And Paul's definitely one of those pioneers, along with John Entwistle, Chris Squire, these guys who were like lead bass players in a way. But I feel like in Paul's case, it still was set tastefully within the context of the songs.
Very different than an Entwistle, right? Like
Yeah.
Entwistle is like I mean, that is like lead bassist on the highest level, right? Blah, 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 blah. Like it's like he is just picking away, like it's sick, like right. But John, I mean, Paul still fits in. I like George. The contributions on this album. I mean, yeah, like to me, I would say he was the breakout star. Like I really, I'm like he's just back up everything. Like everything he does, it's like it's backing up, it's supportive, but it's so strong. Like everything he's doing, it's so strong. Blown
He,
away.
you know, I feel like he's starting to really benefit from all these reappraisals and the legacy. as we look back on the Get Back period, I think like he um, stood out for many people in that his story within that series really stood out. And I think it's a perfect lead into this because, again, with this being the album that he really starts to, pick up on the songwriting. Obviously, he wants to get in on the royalties and all that action. So I think a lot of it was that kind of motivation. But the songs are there. Again, I've said this before in a lot of our previous Beatles videos. Unlike some, maybe John and Paul's stuff. Again, maybe just because there's more volume and stuff, so the odds are more likely. But there is not a George song on any Beatles album that I don't like. I like everything he did within the context of the Beatles, and here, he knocks out some bangers. And when he's not, like you said, the featured player, if you're really paying attention and listening, like his guitar work and his harmonies, just you couldn't ask for a better support player.
100%. Like, I'm thinking like, yeah, God, like, obviously everything on Let It Be is great. Like, yeah, but anyway, yeah, he's just phenomenal in this. Like, he really comes into his own. And I bet this is also like, I had a buddy once who was a swing on Broadway, which is that like you cover, like you're the understudy for every part. So
Yeah.
he had like a sick voice that he could do anything. And so he had to cover, like in case anyone's sick that night, he has to be able to go into everyone's role. Because when one person, like if a lead is sick, someone covers for them, then there's all these spots open. So, and he'd be frustrated at that. And a friend of ours was like, dude, it's like you're so talented that they have to put you in this role because no one else can do that. Like other people are very specific over here, but the fact that you're able to cover such a wide range in your singing and your performing and all that. And it was like, I think you see that with George here, where he's like, he's so strong in so many things that's why I don't think he ever like, I mean, he stands out, but like, I bet he's frustrated, right? Like, and we see it in Let It Be that he's like, I want to do my own thing, but his own thing never reached. I mean, am I wrong? Like his own thing never reaches the height of what he does in this group,
right?
To the extent,
Even
right?
even although I think because he had the backlog of songs like All Things Must Pass, you listen to that and it's just magnificent, right?
Oh, it's
Like
gorgeous.
it's really his kind of spotlight moment, and it's like that all that reserve of talent and frustration and all that stuff really getting a chance to shine. So I think that was his crowning moment there. I think from there, having done it, I don't know if it was as important because if you listen to interviews with him, and that's why he was always reluctant to tour. It just he didn't have that same drive to be in the spotlight the way John and Paul did. So I think a lot of it, even though he had the ability, there are just certain people, just what like we've talked about too, just certain personalities that we both know people who are probably more talented than people that do get the spotlight. But you have to also have that drive to be in the spotlight, which I think once around this period, ironically, where he kind of discovers, Eastern mysticism and all that stuff, the Beatlemania stuff starts losing the allure for him. And I think fame starts meaning less and less for him.
100%, 100%. I was just looking, like, for me, like all his work on Magical Mystery Tour is phenomenal. Like his solo stuff. That's the stuff where I'm like, yeah, like again, like I feel bad. I was thinking about that. I'm like, on his own, he's phenomenal. But again, like to me, on his own and like on Magical Mystery Tour and throughout, like Let It Be and everything, that stuff is still for me growing out of what he's doing with them,
Yeah.
So I'm saying like later stuff, when he went on his own, to me, it didn't have that same pop. It didn't have that same like immediacy or intensity, So anyway,
yeah. Well, I think for any of us too, if we were members of the Beatles, like, if you're in that pressure cooker and you're competing with John and Paul, your stuff's going to be a lot different than when you're on your own for sure. So yeah,
right.
I think that competitive environment, even though it was a friendly competition, I mean, I think everyone, it forced you to be at optimal performance, and so it's still, and also, a key thing about this album is that you can hear it. They're still a group. They're still on the same page, which is way different than what you see in Get Back. By that point, they're definitely pulling apart and they have families and, the energy is not all as centralized on the group. Here and up through Pepper, which I think is the peak of them kind of having a collective vision, they're still they're so in sync on this album, and that's another thing that stands out so much on Revolver. This is like the work, of it can only be the work of the four people just again at peak optimal power, but that synergy that they had together where they were all focused and they all wanted the same thing. It's so
Yeah.
clear on this.
It's so quick because, like, for me, Yellow Submarine, it, like that's the last song I'll bring up for today. Like, Yellow Submarine is like, I've never loved that song, but
Yeah,
so I skipped it over.
I'm
Like,
with you. I'm with you.
Right, but it's so iconically Beatles.
Especially the humor side of what they do.
Right.
The kind of the campy, playful, almost goon kind of inspired stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
With
like
the voices and the just the novelty nature of it. Yeah.
Like the zaniness, right? But like,
Yeah.
so that's like an example where like they elevated and like Ringo to write something and like and to participate and to sing it, whatever, like, right? But it's so, I mean, again, it's not my favorite by any stretch. Like I see no reason when there's such, like, when every song is so gripping intellectually and like and viscerally and like textured, multi-textured, like, to just have to fucking listen to that song is just like, oh my
I
God.
know. It's always, well, when I was a kid, the Ringo songs were always like, okay, needle gets lifted and move. I love Ringo though. I love Ringo. I love his drumming and all that stuff. But yeah, his songs were always skippers for me.
Yeah, they just don't, like, again, but this is to your point about like they're in this like cohesion. Like, I can't say that it's not a Beatles song. Like, it's a Beatles song.
No, and it also speaks to, again, the group, the brotherhood that they had, that they would actually always have a song for Ringo, because Ringo did have his pocket of fans too.
Yeah.
So they always had a song for him, which has given him a career, with his all-star band. He's able to tour behind the songs and have a lengthy enough set list. That's kind of what the bedrock of his stuff is now. So
yeah.
So they looked out for him. And I think that speaks very highly of basically what we understand about them, that kind of the loving, supportive nature of what they were in those early years.
100%. So like, any final thoughts on this album?
Yeah, I have to say, so I remember in the Beatles anthology, George saying that he always saw Rubber Soul and Revolver as like, kind of parts 1 and 2. They could have been the same. I have to say, I vehemently disagree. To me, they are the Pepper Band on this album. They have morphed into the Pepper Band. It just hasn't physically manifested. They still look Beatlemania, but in terms of what they're pursuing artistically and what they're chasing and what they're doing with the studio stuff, to me, this is not Rubber Soul Part 2. This is Sgt. Pepper Part 1. This has more sonically in common with Pepper. I never saw the connection with Rubber Soul, even though those were kind of close period-wise. This really is, to me, like the beginning of the Pepper mentality and kind of what they were bringing, and the psychedelia and all that stuff as well, and writing songs that were definitely straying from pure pop and just danceable stuff to stuff that was avant-garde and experimental, and you had the Eastern stuff. So that, to me, it's always been much more like it's Revolver, Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, that pocket in the middle, all the stuff that existed before as part of the Beatlemania thing, and then with White Album, they start to pare it down in terms of the, over the top production, because John was a bit frustrated with that, wanted more immediacy. So they get back to being more of a rock and roll group.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you to talk about Mystery Tour. Yeah, so that's, yeah, agreed. This, you really start to see it. This is like I wouldn't even say it's the Act 1. It's just like, it's like the first half of Act 1, of that era. Totally.
Yeah, it's like that first step into, through the looking glass or whatever it is, but it's like, yeah, they're getting there. And sonically, to me, and it's the better of the two. For me, it's funny because Pepper was always, I think, from the 60s through maybe like the mid 90s up until anthology period, was always like, everyone's critics number one, and it almost suffers from all that critical, overhype in many ways. But it seemed like there was a turn around the mid 90s where like Revolver, in many critics' estimation, more like the intelligentsia, that sort of all of a sudden became number 1 best album. It's not for me. I've always been an Abbey Road guy, but I will say, of the two, and especially following this remix, I would say that for me, this is the better of the two albums for sure, because I think the songs are stronger, and I think it doesn't suffer from like the Pepper concept or conceit. And I do think with this remix, it's definitely of all the recent remixes done by Giles Martin and company, George Martin's son, this is the best by far. The
Yeah,
stereo 22 remix under headphones, can't go wrong.
I agree with you 100%. I'm not like I can't say I'm not a fan of Pepper, like the individual songs, but like yeah, to me it's just pure candy. Like it's just it's so like it's so what it's trying to be. That's a horrible thing I just said, but it's like it's so stuck in its own concept, you know?
And I think it's also you had to be there for that one. I don't feel that about any of the other Beatles
Yeah,
albums. I feel like they all sort of transcend their time, but I feel like the Pepper thing definitely was that summer of love, the hippie culture, LSD. It's always really locked into that for me. So there's a little bit of a disconnect for me and unrelatability for it, even though still a great album. The Beatles never made a bad album, let's face it, but
right.
it ironically, that's the album that all their entire catalog I connect with the least.
Agreed, agreed. And again, like for some reason this conversation is making me just like I'm gonna have to listen to Magical Mystery Tour. I love Magical Mystery Tour.
Great album. I mean, I like again, Blue Jay Way. It's a song that people really don't think about, or like the instrumental Flying. I love those pieces. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
nobody mentions flying and stuff like that, but it's yeah, it's just I love the flow of that album, which is funny because it's really a hybrid of again, it was an EP in England, which was just the Magical Mystery Tour songs, and here in America it was stretched out to an album length by including singles that had been released already, like Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, All You Need Is Love, stuff like that. So it made it to full length.
Fool on the Hill was originally part of it though, right? Like
Part of the Magical Mystery Tour, yeah.
yeah. Oh, such a good song. Well, that's all I got today, Bruce. You got anything else?
I think we covered it, but
Yeah.
definitely, what would you say? Like, if we do out of a 5-star system, for me, it's 4.5 stars. If we do a 10 scale, to me, it's 8 out of 10 for this new remix. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say that. I would agree with those numbers because it's like yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think like what is a full five, right? Like there's I would say 8 out of 10, 45. Like because it's I think it's great. It's so great. Like in listening to it, it's like, God, it's so complex. Those harmonies are sick. Like you're absolutely right. It's four guys just being at their peak and their prime. But I think in terms of like that will make it to that 5 is like for me, like Let It Be, Abbey Road, like there's just something so like so worthwhile in that. Like that I could just listen to those over and over and over
Majestic.
again.
Something
Yeah.
majestic about those albums. Yeah.
And we've seen like with Get Back, like how not majestic the process was to make those, but the finished outcome, like the product is just so majestic. So yeah, I would agree 100%.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, there it is. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe. Bruce is so brilliant. It's just so worth. I get so into. I'm like, ooh, talk about that, Bruce. Like so.
Oh, yes, and one more thing I want to plug, because we didn't do like a forensic take on this stuff, like a lot of other people out there. But if you do want to get more of a really in-depth view, I highly recommend our buddy Michael Noland, who had dropped the video yesterday, and he really went in depth on his analysis of this by comparing, prior stereo mix, the new mono and the new stereo mixes of that, and he does it song by song. So for those of you who want more of like that audio file touch, definitely we'll link that up in our description here as well. But for those of you who have stayed with us to the end, we thank you so much, and we'll be back a lot sooner than this last gap.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for watching today again. Thank you.
Take care.